I'm really pleased today to be able to welcome you to the last seminar of 2025, as you would expect at the end of the year. It's been a really great year of talks so far, and then we've got a really excellent speaker today to finish off the 2025 round of talks before we refresh in 2026 with a new selection of speakers. So I'm really pleased today to be able to introduce Dr. Monique Botha. Monique is an associate professor here at Durham University in the Centre for Neurodiversity and Development. They've recently completed a prestigious Leverhulme Research Fellowship, and I'm sure some of the talk today will feature some of the research that's been conducted during that fellowship. And before completing their Leverhulme Fellowship, Monique had an ESRC postdoctoral fellowship. So has held two really prestigious independent research fellowships over the last few years, and has used that research to really drive forward the neurodiversity agenda and really thinking about how we compassionately and ethically conduct research in this field. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Monique as today's speaker. And I'll hand over to Monique to share your screen, please.
Hi everyone, thank you so much, Debbie, for that really lovely and flattering welcome. Slightly embarrassed, but yes, thank you. You know, when people say nice things about you and you're like, well, not going to cope with that, but very generous. Let me figure out a better way of sharing this because I'm not used to sharing in quite that way. Give me 2 seconds. Share the window. There we go.
Wait for it to come up. We had it and then it disappeared. Oh, here it comes again. Yeah.
Fantastic. I will get started, and I'm going to start a timer on my side because I'm neurodivergent myself and time is wibbly wobbly. It has very little meaning in my world. And I could talk about this for hours if someone would let me. But hi everyone, so I'm Dr. Monique Botha, and I've spent a lot of time over the last few years thinking about what researchers over the communities that they work with. And I'm going to tap into something very specific here, and I actually thought it was a nice way to round out the calendar year, this being the last for December for the 2025 talks. Because it's been a little bit of a weird year. And I don't think you need to be even that prominent in neurodiversity to notice that it's been a bit of a weird year. So I'm going to focus on dehumanizing language and what we owe the communities we work with in terms of language, but also how these things get caught up in political systems. And hopefully it comes together into this coherent, meaningful talk that people walk away with something solid that they can do next year. Where's the down here? So I wanted to start, and this slide might be really overwhelming, but I wanted to think about context. And I've spent the last few months on this really steep learning curve with public engagement in terms of like live broadcast, radio stuff, because every time things settle down, someone prominent in a place of power says something really quite offensive about neurodivergent people or the communities, and it starts all over again. A lot of people probably recognize or might recognize the person that manned their RFK, very heavily photoshopped photo, I think, like, but whatever, bit of jazz. And the other one is Liz Kendall, who is an MP here in the UK for the government that's in power. Oh, that's moved on, shouldn't have yet. And again and again and again, we find ourselves in this place where politicians are weaponizing neurodiversity-focused research to make some pretty horrific statements or claims. So we have RFK, who said that Adderall is dangerous, but heroin was great for treating his ADHD. We have RFK, who also said that he wanted to send people with ADHD, and he classed, by the way, he classed ADHD as having an addiction for receiving treatment for ADHD. But he wanted to send ADHDers to a work farm. And if they grow organic produce and they do heavy work, they suddenly won't have ADHD. Liz Kendall and crew, everyone involved at the moment in disability benefits in the UK has made these claims that it's overdiagnosed, that the benefits claims are soaring and everyone's getting a handout, and you can just claim that you have ADHD or autism and suddenly you'll have a new car that you can drive that's free, paid by the taxpayers, and genuinely ridiculous claims. Then you've got the CDC changing it to claim that, vaccines do not cause autism is not an evidence-based claim. And this is really quite dangerous. You have people like Wes Streeting saying that ADHD, autism, and all of this is overdiagnosed. People making claims that people are trying to get these diagnoses because life is just too stressful, like whatever that means. But at the center of a lot of these things and a lot of these conversations that are being had, you've got researchers, right? So you've got people producing work, and one of the biggest examples of this was the idea that paracetamol or Tylenol causes autism, right? People are drawing on real work that exists there, but the shaky work, don't get me wrong, the most robust work has shown that there is no relationship. But you've got researchers getting pulled into these political narratives. And I actually think this is really dangerous and something we need to address. And I want to explain the role of the researcher in this. That means that I've been thinking a lot about the fact-value divide. So I don't know if anyone knows who that guy is, but it's David Hume. Luckily, people are reevaluating his entire career, and they should, because he was not a neutral person, right? And then we've got Hilary Putnam. And these are two people who have been foundational in discussing the is-ought problem divide, which is the idea that a fact cannot tell you how something should be because how something should be is a value. David Hume argued that these things were entirely separate, that you, as a scientist, you witness something and it cannot tell you how something should be, because that is in the realm of something else entirely. That's in the realm of aesthetics, it's in the realm of ethics, it's in the realm of the humanities, it's in the realm of decision makers. Hilary Putnam argued that the second, sorry, I think this is on a timer, it's moving forward without me, but Hilary Putnam argued that the second that you start to prod at the fact-value divide, it falls apart. And I believe that Hilary Putnam is right. When you witness what something is, I think you do and can draw an ought from it, even down to the idea that science ought to be value-free. I think that that is a normative claim, and it's not value-free. I think instead, science ought to be transparent about the values that underpin the work that we are taking. And I've been thinking a lot about this in the context of what we owe science, and I don't think we can give it being value-free, because I think norms influence all of the science that we do. It influences the rhetoric, but also in terms of what we owe our communities. And I think when you witness communities that are suffering, and when I talk about suffering, I mean the poor quality of life, high rates of suicide, high rates of poor mental health, high rates of homelessness, school, leaving school early, high rates of unemployment, underemployment, discrimination, victimization. I think as researchers, when we witness this, when we do science in this, when we do research in it, if we are not thinking about the ought and what neurodivergent people ought to be experiencing, we're missing out, we're losing out, and so are communities. And so I think the fact-value divide, or the idea that we should be objective, that we should not be value-driven, or that research is not value-driven in and of the first place, ends up cornering us into this hole where we don't acknowledge that we want things to be better for the communities we work with. And actually, that is a moral obligation, I argue. So all the way back in 2016, I came across this article that argued that autistic people were less domesticated than non-autistic people, which I think is obviously horrific. And obviously very dehumanizing. And they even had this lovely, I say lovely graph pointing to physical features to be like, look at how abnormal these people are, right? And it was basically like this reawakening of phrenology to some degree, but just for autistic people. And this shows some of those underlying values, right? Because we've got this idea about normative development and abnormal development. But it takes it one step further towards that dehumanization that I'm going to address in my talk, which is this idea that autistic people are less evolved. We have not made it out of animalistic stages of development towards what they would consider to be human. But it's not the only piece. From the ground up, we've got this rottenness. Even where people talk about the value of autism, it's only valued in a particular kind of way. So if you can produce, someone says originality is attractive even in the domestic sphere, as long as it does not topple over into uncomfortable eccentricity. It's only a few people with ASD who combine originality with high levels of intelligence and industry who are likely to make sufficiently sustainable salient contribution that their absence might be considered unaffordable. So as long as we're producing, we're affordable, but if we need support, if we're not deemed intelligent enough, then we are not considered unaffordable. So anyway, here you've got the norm there of production, right? You've got an idea that you need to be producing and bringing value, and that is the only way you can get a social value. Someone here says, in general, it seems that neither apes nor children with autism have, at least to the same extent as typically developing human children, the motivation or capacity to share things psychologically. This means that they have very limited skills for creating things culturally with other people. So we're uncultured, we're unconnected, we can't create shared meaning with other people. And here we have someone saying that autistic people have impaired theory of mind, and the logical extension of this deficit is that we cannot know our own minds, let alone the minds of others, right? So here you have that denial of any like complex metacognition. Here we have someone saying the person with autism's difficulty is more profound, making the possibility of identifying with the community more daunting. So communities of disabled people exist, but the autistic community is not one of them. There is not, nor could there ever be, a community of autistic people, since a failure of theory of mind would preclude being a part of any community. So not just an autistic community, any community. So here we have autistic people shoved out of community boundaries, which are also moral boundaries. And then we have the one that people pull out really, really often from lovers. And this is abject dehumanization, right? So pulling out that middle bit of the quote, you see, you start from scratch when you work with an autistic child. You have a person in the physical sense, they have hair and nose and mouth, but they are not a person or people in the psychological sense. And here we have someone arguing that autistic integrity seems more akin to the arguments informing environmentalists' familiar demands for communal responsibility towards non-human animals. And I've been thinking, again, I say thinking a lot, this mulls over in my mind all the time, about the place that researchers have in setting standards for how we treat neurodivergent people in the public, for what we will afford to them as rights. And one of my papers that I published a few years ago brought all of this together into this argument that you can't belong to a community that has these profoundly negative outcomes, go into research and pretend that you are not there specifically to make a change. And I think when you belong to a community, and I'm autistic, I'm ADHD, I'm neurodivergent in a lot of interesting ways. And it's easy for me to recognize that because I belong to the community. But more and more as I've gone on, I've been thinking about knowledge production more wholesale and who is and isn't willing to acknowledge values, who is and isn't willing to acknowledge what they're bringing to the communities that they work with. And neurodivergent people are often very quick to be like, well, this is my perspective, this is my positionality. And actually, sometimes it's neurotypical people who are willing to rely on notions of objectivity as a means to an end to be taken seriously. And actually, this can be quite damaging because it leaves neurodivergent people in a position where we disclose we have to be a specific thing. But actually, if you're working with any of these communities in any sense, surely we should all be working towards a shared goal of changing some of this inequality. And yet, what we see here is this language being employed by researchers to argue very specific, almost like both moral and social deformities amongst autistic people. And they use this language that's shrouded in a sense of objectivity, that it embodies all of these social norms and cultural norms that they're just not really being like explicit about. So I thought, why don't we measure some of this? And in one of my first studies, I did measure, I did a mixed method study of autism researchers and coded free text responses because it was all open questions for dehumanization, objectification, and it was everywhere. So when I think about dehumanization, I'm talking about that denial of full humanness, infantilization compared to non-human animals, treated as lacking in rationality, refinement, cultural and ability, as these ideas of people as passive, fungible, machine-like. In terms of objectification, there's instrumentality, which is using someone to a means to an end, denial of autonomy, inertness, spoilability, ownership, denial of subjectivity. So, for example, being able to know your own mind, or fungibility, which means that you're considered replaceable by any other member of your community who is basically the same, right? And I've been doing work on this for the last few years. And in that study that I mentioned, there was 64% of the free text responses from autism researchers had at least one cue to dehumanize autistic people. And I wanted to take this work further and be like, okay, how, talking about autistic people in this way, what happens then, right? So we know that this is happening. I've given you all of these examples of the way researchers are just happy to talk about autistic people. I did this work with actual researchers, contemporary setting. So I wanted to take that one step further. Before I explain this, I also want to clarify, because when we talk about animalistic dehumanization, some people are like, yeah, but you're saying that animals have like a lower rank socially and culturally, that they are also not capable of these things. And I want to make clear that I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that in the predominant social cultural context, where a lot of these things are happening, there is this idea that animals are not capable of these things, and that non-human animals are. Sorry, that human animals are, but non-human animals aren't. So I just wanted to clarify that actually I don't subscribe to a lot of these ideas, but it's what you get out there. So by relegating autistic people into the non-human animal category, you open them up to the same kind of violence that affects animals. So anyway, continuing. And I've been focusing about this because I don't think norms and culture and science are that separate. And Karen Barad's work on this is probably the most important meta-science book that you will read in your lifetime, I would argue, because she talks about how entangled science, culture, and the researcher are. So that dehumanizing, objectifying rhetoric that is enshrined in normativity, it creates actual material conditions for violence in society for neurodivergent people, right? And then the repercussions of that violence creates that further breeding ground for future dehumanization. The perfect example of this is, for example, neurodivergent people have considerably worse employment, mental health outcomes. Thinking about like suicide. Then you have researchers argue that, okay, this is evidence of the original pathology, right? So if autistic people or people with ADHD are so much more likely to experience suicidality, then that is evidence that we need to cure autism and ADHD, because that's how we prevent suicidality, right? So you're creating the conditions there and it just keeps feeding it. And people are very slow to step back and look at the conditions in which this suicidality is actually emerging, which is stigma and prejudice and the fact that we expose these communities to so much violence, and then when they have poor outcomes, we're like, oh no, this is why we actually need to cure them. And there you can see the entanglement of some of that culture and that science. So I did a series of studies with vignettes, and it was predominantly UK, US samples. And actually, I want to do this a lot more broadly, but I haven't had the chance yet. And maybe someone will give me funding. I don't know. But it was with adults from the UK and US, and there was 4 studies in total. And I took vignettes first from peer-reviewed, published autism research, and I removed any mention of autism. So I just said it was about a redacted social group. So any mention of autism or autistic people became redacted. And people were randomly, they were randomly assigned an order, but you'd get both the vignette that was more humanizing and the dehumanizing vignette. And this is all based on published peer-reviewed autism research. And so this is the dehumanizing vignette, which it's based very explicitly on some of the things that I've shown you in terms of the way that we talk about autistic people. And we also came up with a humanizing vignette. And the humanizing vignette took a lot longer. I just want to put that out there. But finding humanizing descriptions of autistic people in autism research was a challenge, a horrible challenge, and took a lot longer to write and figure out than the dehumanizing vignette, because the dehumanization is everywhere. But actually, it's very rare that you come across more humanizing descriptions. And we gave these vignettes alongside measures of dehumanization. So one of them was an AVERT measure, which is that idea of evolution. And you can see here the humanizing vignette. Autistic people were rated as significantly more evolved than the dehumanizing vignette, but also quite substantially below human, which is obviously problematic. There was a denial of complex secondary emotions. So the humanizing condition, participants rated the targets as being able to produce both primary and complex secondary emotions. Whereas in the dehumanizing vignette, there was both a reduced capacity towards primary emotions, which points to mechanistic dehumanization, but also a much more reduced secondary emotion capability compared to the primary emotion. Complex emotions are the kinds of emotions that we associate with humans, but not non-human animals. For example, things like hope, things like guilt or shame or contentment. So there's both that infrahumanization, that overt dehumanization, and also a clear pattern of mechanistic and animalistic dehumanization. So they rated the dehumanized vignette as having lower capabilities towards human nature traits that were positive, higher negative human nature traits that point towards not being human, and the same for human uniqueness. And to give you an idea about what sits in these categories, they rated autistic or the dehumanized vignette as being less active, less curious, less friendly, less helpful, less loving, more impatient, impulsive, jealous, nervous, shy. And these are meant to be the traits that separate us from animals. Then in terms of mechanistic dehumanization, lower broad-mindedness, lower conscientiousness, lower humbleness, lower politeness, lower thoroughness, more disorganized, more hard-hearted, more ignorant, more rude, which again is meant to be about that cultural inability, right? It's people who aren't part of our shared culture. And then I replicated it in the second study, but I also extended it. So the second study had the same setup with a different group of adults from the UK and the US. And I wanted to replicate that original finding and then also bring in moral disengagement. And we did replicate the original findings and also found that in study 2, there was higher moral disengagement from the dehumanized vignette, right? Which means that we consider them outside of our moral boundaries, not our responsibility, which kind of sets people up for the permissibility of harm, which means it's okay if they get harmed because they're not in our moral community. And it made me think about where this model would stand. So my proposed model for this was that the condition, humanizing or dehumanizing, would obviously predict dehumanization, and it would predict moral disengagement through that dehumanization, right? So essentially, we're arriving at the moral disengagement through that process of dehumanization. And lo and behold, across all of the types of dehumanization that I mentioned, that is what we found. So the condition predicted moral disengagement through that dehumanization, apart from secondary emotional denial, which is the denial of complex emotions, which uniquely out of all of the measures of dehumanization also predicted moral disengagement directly, as well as through dehumanization. So that there's something important going on there about the denial of those complex emotions. Study 3, I wanted to replicate it again, including that new finding with 145 neurotypical adults from the US and the UK. Same setup. But this time I also wanted to have a look at what happens then about what we think is acceptable treatment for autistic people. So for the dehumanized target, we thought that it was more acceptable to assimilate them and also for remediation. Interestingly, normalization was equally high on both of them, and it was on par with assimilation and remediation in the dehumanized categories. So there's also something going on there about the idea of normalization. And we also had a look, okay, what would this mean for willingness to include? So when we talk about autistic people in that dehumanizing way, as in those vignettes, the willingness for raters to include them is fairly drastically different to the more humanized vignette. And the differences there are also much bigger than the ones around remediation and assimilation. So not only do we want to remediate and assimilate the dehumanized group more, but we also want to accept them a lot less, right? And those are two interlinked but different things, and this is important. So looking at this, we think that the risk from genetic intervention and also from behavioral interventions is equal across both groups. The humanized vignette, the dehumanized vignette, this is where we think like the risk of harm is. And yet, for the dehumanized group, we think that any treatment outweighs any risk of harm, right? Which means that we're more likely or we're more willing to potentially subject those people to bad, potentially harmful treatments when we dehumanize them. And again, my thought was this is going to go through moral disengagement, right? So that support for remediation is going to travel through dehumanization, moral disengagement to remediation. And that there's something going on potentially with support for eugenics, which is this idea that there is an ideal, there is a norm that we are meant to be developing at the same rate as or in the same way too. And similarly, I thought it would be the same model for inclusion. And lo and behold, dehumanization doesn't push remediation directly. It works by, it seems, elevating moral disengagement, which in turn increases support for remediation. And the support for eugenics seems to predict a lower baseline of human attributions at the starting point. So essentially, the more you support eugenics, the less likely you are to humanize autistic people in the first place. But really, it's the moral disengagement that ends up predicting that. And you see a similar thing with inclusion. Dehumanization doesn't suppress inclusion directly necessarily. It works by elevating that moral disengagement which in turn seems to reduce support for inclusion. And again, support for eugenics predicts that lower baseline attributions as a starting point. And again, interestingly, denial of secondary emotion directly and indirectly predicts that lower inclusion. So it works through moral disengagement. However, there's also a direct relationship between infrahumanization, which is the denial of complex secondary emotions, predicting a lower drive for inclusion. So when you think autistic people are incapable, or any group is incapable of experiencing those complex emotions, you're less interested in including them. But the media is an intermediary, right? In other work that we've done, and I'll show you how this is connected, we had a look at where representations in the media of autistic people fall. Thinking about the stereotype content model, where considerations between where you put people in warmth and competence will change the way that you stereotype them, right? And there's this idea that if you consider them low in warmth and competence, it'll be contemptuous prejudice. And you can see the three other quadrants there. And we took 1,000 statements in the media about autistic people in news media in the UK, and rated them across these quadrants, both on warmth and competence. And we get a similar message, which is that the majority of these 1,000 snippets fall into that lower quadrant, where we consider autistic people to be both low warmth and low competence. And actually, across political leanings in UK newspapers, this didn't really shift or change. Importantly, a lot of our media in the UK does sit towards the right rather than the left. So it could have been things like sample size, but we don't see that political divide that you usually see with equality issues. It was just overwhelmingly negative. And when you refer, and what the only pattern we found, so identity first versus person first language, so like autistic person versus person with autism, didn't actually change this finding. But what did change it, and where you saw the highest density of that kind of like quadrant, contemptuous prejudice quadrant, was when we referred to autistic people in the abstract, which is just autism. So no people, it's not an autistic person, it's not a person with autism, it's just referring to autism in the abstract, which is what you see done a lot when it's about research about autistic people, right? That's when we talk about autism as if it could exist in a petri dish. And research is where you see a lot of the hostile drive to separate autism from autistic people. And in my earlier work, I saw this where none of the researchers would be like, oh, I want to eradicate autistic people, because that would look really bad. But some researchers did say that they wanted to eradicate autism, with no real recognition that autism is an only human thing, right? Like you can't distill it down to a petri dish. So thinking about the media as an intermediary, we did this study again, this time 130 adults from the UK and the US, and it was newsprint media that mentioned autism research. So we rebuilt these vignettes, and it was the same design, just new vignettes, and the vignettes were all autism research that had been mentioned in the media and taken from those articles. So here, social interaction is a fundamental characteristic of human behavior. Individuals have low motivation to interact with others. Scientists trying to understand redacted thinking eye tracking study they conducted on monkeys may help them understand. The next step for the researchers is to test it on mutant mice, which displayed behavioral deficits similar to those in human pathologies. Although the behavior in mice is not directly equivalent to that in humans, researchers note that it was largely analogous to empathy and social behavior. A lot of what we do is based on imitation. If somebody rises to get up and go, it's an almost automatic response to get up and rise as well. You can learn to a large degree to simulate empathy. However, this is not possible for the truly redacted person. As for them, another person doesn't exist at all. Like the people that are meant to model, mice with the mutation tended to be more hyperactive than siblings without it, running around the cages much more. They were nonetheless generally heavier. They had slightly smaller brains and a little less of the white matter that speeds communication between different brain regions. Abnormal head circumference seems to be predictive too. And then a more humanizing vignette. So people and other people have different experiences and therefore perceive and interact with the world differently from each other. Such a mismatch in perspectives can lead to difficulties in understanding each other. This mutual disconnect can contribute to social anxiety and misunderstandings and even reduce quality of life for redacted adults. Many participants described being misread, unfairly judged, ignored, or treated as untrustworthy simply because their cues didn't match expectations. This matters because redacted people often experience discrimination and exploitation in society. They may have unmet needs, even when they appear to be coping with life. Labels like redacted are ways of saying, notice me, I matter, I'm not broken. I do not need to be fixed, I need to be heard. Rather, redacted should be celebrated to nourish a positive sense of identity. There's so much amazing beauty and love, resilience, and resistance. And we see a similar thing again, apart from no difference in human nature, the negative traits, but a big difference in the positive traits, a big difference in human uniqueness as well. And here we see the similar pattern of infrahumanization, which is the denial of secondary emotions, a denial of primary emotions, but not to the same degree as those secondary ones, and a greater degree of secondary emotional denial for the dehumanized vignette than the humanized one. We see a similar pattern around remediation and assimilation, with no significant difference in normalized again, and the same for inclusion. So same pattern for these media mentions. And once again, in terms of the risk of harm, we actually perceive in this, with the way that the media talks about it, we perceive the dehumanized group to be less harmed by these interventions. So the risk is lower for these interventions. And again, the big difference in any treatment outweighing the risk of any kind of harm. Sorry, there it is, my mouse had disappeared. So the dehumanized group, the risk is more acceptable. And again, across these models, we see the same thing with these media mentions, where it's working by pushing on moral disengagement. And again, moral disengagement is the lever, and interestingly, secondary emotional denial also directly with these ones decreased inclusion, whereas primary emotional denial doesn't. So what is the big picture? Dehumanization seems to reduce support for inclusion and increase support for mediation, primarily by going through moral disengagement, right? So moral disengagement is the lever. Humanist appraisals tend to function as the upstream driver of that moral disengagement, apart from that secondary emotional denial. So denying complex emotions like hope, like shame, seems to work directly in a way that the other forms of dehumanization don't. Dehumanizing rhetoric in reporting of autism research also seems to facilitate this moral disengagement, primarily through denying autistic people these core human traits. And dehumanizing autism research and the way it's reported in the media seems to there seem to be a higher degree of moral disengagement, and potentially it's from some of that sensationalistic reporting, and that seems to result in a greater acceptability of harm from intervention. Sorry, that was a mouthful. And it's not just a few bad apples. So at the same time, I was doing this computational analysis of 60,000 autism research abstracts, and I'm busy doing the same thing in the full papers. And we see that the top topics tend to be intervention, genetics, causes, cognition. Mental health is like breaking up there, but it's like way below the others. And when you look at this as a proportion, the relative share of topics, we haven't moved on. We're still obsessed with interventions, genetics, causes, cognitions. We are still objectifying autistic people. We haven't given room to any of the topics that actually show that autistic people have subjectivity that is experienced, that they're experiencing the world in anywhere in the same way that neurotypical people do, that some of these mental health problems are actually social problems. We haven't focused on like minoritized groups. We haven't focused on joy. There's just about nothing on aging. And that language underlies a lot of this. We are still talking primarily about a disorder. All of the other language lags so far behind, and there's this idea that neurodiversity is this huge wave that's going to engulf everything, and we don't see that. Like, when you actually look at it like this, we are talking about things like profound autism. I do not ascribe to that term. We're still obsessed with functioning labels. We are still diverting almost all of our attention to this disorder model. That hasn't changed. The sentiment, doing a sentiment analysis on these abstracts, we associate more negative emotions. Researchers are talking about autistic people with more negative emotions, higher sadness, fewer positive emotions compared to the way they describe neurotypical people in the studies, and lower joy. Then you get to disgust. We talk about autistic people with more disgust than non-autistic people in the sentiment analysis. We talk about them with more fear. We talk about them with lower trust, and higher anger. And the one that wasn't there but should have been was also lower surprise. And you might be like, why does surprise matter? But surprise is agency. When someone surprises us, they've used agency in a way, right? Like, the surprise is at the heart of agency because it means that someone is acting in their environment with agency. And we don't associate these things with autistic people in autism research. So pulling these things together with like the is-ought problem and Karen Barad's work and the media and the scientists, we are not separate. We are all part of this ecosystem that is creating an idea about what is and is not okay for autistic people, how autistic people should be treated. The way that we talk about autism, both in the media and in autism research, lays this ground both for how we justify future autism research, but also for what the public thinks is acceptable in terms of inclusion versus remediation. But even when we think about remediation, it can shape the way that people think it is acceptable to remediate autism, including with things like risky treatments or treatments that have the ability to produce a lot more harm than good. So witnessing this, I don't think the is-ought problem stands distinct. I think we see the way things are for neurodivergent people, and we should have enough ambition to think about the way that they ought to be, how we ought to do science, and how science ought to tackle some of these problems that neurodivergent people are facing. And I'd been doing this work for coming up with like a framework for social and cultural responsibility, but I want to hone in on two things. So responsibility for the product, including the media. When our work gets picked up in dehumanizing ways, we, given the amount of social and cultural power that we have, should be able to stand up and say, actually, that is not what this was intended for. And actually, I did something potentially that left ambiguity here. I think that we have ethical responsibility for the way that our research is used in the media. And then thinking about impact, not only outwards, but inwards. If you're not breaking down the system, you're reinforcing it. So, and this links to what I'm going to talk about next, which are these recommendations. There should be no room for dehumanization in the work that we produce, right? And this goes back to that ethical responsibility. I think we need to work together to repeatedly rehumanize neurodivergent people, to stop objectifying them, to treat them as if they had agency, subjectivity. There should be no way that anyone can read your paper and leave this and think about neurodivergent people, whether autistic, ADHD, whatever, and think that there is something subhuman going on here. I don't think media engagement is optional at the moment. And every time someone really powerful stands up and says something like paracetamol causes autism, I think we need a robust response as a community of researchers to this misinformation, right? Which means that we need to keep working outwards, not inwards. We need to write papers for the public, not just other researchers. That's part of tackling misinformation head on again and again and again and again. When Donald Trump made that ridiculous announcement, I must have done like 15 interviews in like a 12-hour period. And at the end of it, I wanted to put my head through a wall, because to me, it's not a waste correcting that misinformation. But I think about all the research that needs to be platformed, and it was that. That is depressing. Values aren't a dirty word, and they do not contaminate. This is the most important one. The idea that science is objective or ought to be objective doesn't hold. Transparency is key. So I think more people need to reflect on the values and what brought them to this research, and to actually embody some of that. Rehumanization of neurodivergent people is a goal in and of itself, and should be embedded in the research process. If you're creating studies that limit the ability for neurodivergent people to express agency or to be represented through agency, that is dehumanization. And also, lastly, that science is never free from politics. We need to fight this moral disengagement that I see happening day in, day out in the media. And I see people withdrawing from any consideration of harm. I see benefits every time they go to slash them. I see the waiting lists, and that is a political choice in the UK. Like the waiting lists neurodivergent people face, that is a choice. And we need to fight against the public's moral disengagement from these issues before we can actually really contend with them head on. Anyway, thank you very much. It's always awkward finishing up a talk, but obviously we'll have questions. But there is a survey if anyone wants to do it. Yes.
Thanks, Monique. That was fantastic. I'm sure